We talk about HBCU athletes needing to go to these pre-draft bowls and show out. That's exactly what Carson Vinson did in day one of the Senior Bowl. He was one of the biggest stars for the first day. Oh, yeah, it's locked on HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darrion Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald Sports editor and current contributing writer at USA Today's Saints Wire. And remember, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey is over. Just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Starts with an S and ends with an S. Will Darrion ever start calling Twitter by their new name? I don't know, but I don't think so. Stay tuned to find out. We'll wrap up today's episode with a look at our pre-draft snubs. We'll look at our pre-draft snubs because I do believe that there are three players who should have been invited to the Shrine Bowl or Senior Bowl, but I want to kick it off with somebody who was. Carson Vinson made it to the Senior Bowl. He is the lone player, right? Carson Vinson is the lone HBCU player who is at the Senior Bowl, so he had a heavy weight placed upon him. But let me tell you what, in day one, he was the biggest star, or at least one of the biggest stars of either team. You could use that as a double entendre because I could make an argument that he checked three bona fide boxes, and one of those is his measurements. The other one would be his on-field performance, and then the next box is one that, depending on who you are, you may not look too deeply into it, but the post-practice press conference, those interviews that he had to do, those quotes that he had to deliver. Those quotes he had to deliver, you may not think matters that much, but I would argue it translated, if I had to guess, I would argue that it would translate into those pre-draft meetings with the NFL teams. So as I'm looking at Carson Vinson checking every box, and we're going to get into each one as the episode goes on, he checks the measurement box. He checks the on-field performance box in day one. And then he also checks the box of confidence of delivering quotables that I would argue, or at least assume, translated into meetings with professional teams. So let's get into the measurements first, because it is a double entendre to call him one of the biggest stars. Carson Vinson weighed in at 314 pounds. People were questioning his size. People say, oh, he's just 300. You know, he's 6'7", technically. He's 6'6" and 7/8. 6'7". But he also comes in at 314 pounds, which was a big deal because a lot of people were wondering, is he on the lighter side? When you got somebody who's that big, we want to see what the weight's like. Okay, cool. You got that 314. And I've seen multiple accounts talk about how he was one of the biggest winners of the measurements. See, I say day one, but that only has to do with his on-field. The measurements are forever. The shirt and shorts, that's forever. He doesn't have to re-weigh in every day to see if he keeps his weight consistent. He did that already. His height is his height. His arm length is his arm length. And if we're talking about the longest arms at the event, Carson Vinson has the second longest arms at the Senior Bowl at 35 inches and 1/8, 35 and 1/8 inches, right? So from a measurement standpoint, you're looking at a player who really jumps off the screen. But the reason everybody is talking about Carson Vinson on Tuesday afternoon is not because of what he did in the shirts and shorts. It's about the dominant performance that he had during one-on-ones. And you see many people, I'm going to read some of the reactions that you heard about Carson Vinson's day one at the Senior Bowl. But Carson Vinson showcased, this is who I am. And he vocalized, this is who I am. I would argue that the two reps that gained the most traction is one against LSU, Savon Jones, and then there's another one against Shamar Stewart out of Auburn. I believe, no, it was Texas A&M, out of Texas A&M. And in both of those, it was two completely different reps. It was two completely different reps. The two reps that get the most attention, you had the one against Savon Jones, where Jones tried to really run the arc around him. He tried to use speed. Carson Vinson had good feet. But that's not the one that everybody's talking about because it was good. He showed physicality. He put Jones on the ground. Fell on top of him. So he showed that physicality, that mentality. But it was the one against Shamar Stewart that got the most traction. It was the one against Shamar Stewart in which Stewart tried to hit an inside spin move on him, and that failed. Vincent had to show his really good feet. He had to show intensity. I'm trying to see how I could describe it. So you go up, he spins inside, he carries him across the face of the quarterback and into the backfield and into all of the players, and then he begins to literally headbutt people. There was a certain mentality that was shown without him ever having to utter a word. Carson Vinson didn't have to say a single word, and I knew what type of time he was on. But once the practice was over, he did begin to speak, and he delivered one of my favorite quotes, and I think is a quote that everybody should live by. He said, "I'm not playing up a level." Matter of fact, let me get it directly, because he does say it's a culmination of everything he's working for. He said, "It's not really me playing above my level. It's me playing my level. I'm Carson Vinson, and this is what I do." There is a stigma that you got to play up. No, you just got to perform. When we talk about HBCU players going against Power 4, Group of 5 schools, it's not about, oh, you got to play up now. No, you just have to perform on the same level that you do when you're playing small schools. It's not like if you're averaging 9 tackles a game, I need you to go and have 23. No, it's you be you. And I think that Carson Vinson's quote after practice is saying, "I'm not playing above my level. I'm playing at my level. I'm just playing against bigger school people." That's the attitude that they all step into with. I don't know if we see everybody successfully execute it, but that is the attitude and the mentality that they should all have. Another one that he said, as far as quote, is talking about how he plays the game of football. And for the record, this quote was prefaced by Ryan Fowler saying Carson Vinson had a dominant day one. I told you I'm going to read some of the things that we have seen on social media about Vinson, but he says, Carson says, "There's people that like football and there's people that love football. I need it. This is all I do 24/7, 24/10. We got dogs at HBCUs. We got dogs in the FCS. I'm not here as a charity case. I'm here to play football." There was another part in there where he says he's addicted, but because I heard the interview, but that's just me reading this out, right? You have to understand the way that he is approaching the game, to me, and not even the game, but this event to me is the complete correct attitude. I'm not a charity case. I'm going to play football. I'm not playing above my level. You have the confidence is here. There's no question that the confidence is here for Carson Vinson. And in day one, you're looking at a big reason in why he has the confidence. You have to be a little bit delusional, right? I really do feel like you have to be a little bit delusional to be that great. Because if I'm the best player alive, I have to feel like I'm the best player ever. If I'm the best player ever, I have to be whatever the next thing above that is in my head. So there's a tad bit of delusion that comes with it, but you got to mix it with realism. You know, I'm not telling you to be overconfident, but I do believe that a tad bit of delusion is pretty beneficial when trying to be great. As far as Carson Vinson goes, Carson Vinson was one of the biggest stars at the Senior Bowl. Carson Vinson was one of the biggest stars at the Senior Bowl, and we could go by measurements of his weight, of his height, of his arm length. We could go based off of that, or we could be a little bit less literal and talk about how he won in the measurements. He won on the field with 2 big-time reps against 2 SEC edge rushers. That's huge when looking at a guy coming in from the SWAC. And then lastly, I would assume that he had a pretty good interview, because in these post-game press or these post-practice press conferences, he delivered great quotes about the attitude of HBCU players, the quality of play on his subdivision, while also talking about not playing above his level, but just carrying the standard that he's had his entire career into this one event. Carson Vinson checked every box in day one. There's still days to go, but you can't argue that he was one of the biggest stars and one of the leaders and biggest winners of day one in the Senior Bowl. Now, as he pushed forward, there's a couple of guys who I would have liked to see at this Senior Bowl. Unfortunately, they weren't there. Let's break down why I have a little bit of an issue with it and why I think they should have been there. as we continue with Locked On HBCU. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, and FanDuel is the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. Super Bowl 59 is here, and you're just in luck. If you've never tried FanDuel and you're new to this whole thing, the time to strike is now. Because if you put down a $5 bet and you win while being new to FanDuel, you get $200 back in bonus bets. It doesn't matter if you put that game down on a random basketball game. Doesn't matter if you wait until the big game itself, Super Bowl Sunday, to put some money down. I don't know if they have anything for the Pro Bowl. They very well could. There is always options. There are always options for you to make a little bit of extra cash. It's just about if you want to take advantage of it. Make it a basketball game. I heard De'Aaron Fox is trying to get out of Sacramento. Make it the football game. What do you think Jalen Hurts is going to do against the Chiefs in a Super Bowl rematch from just 2 years ago? It's all on you. But if you go to FanDuel and put down a $5 bet and it wins, you get $200 back in bonus bets. Go to FanDuel.com to make every moment more. As we continue rolling on today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, make sure you're checking out Locked On Today, which is going to give you the biggest stories around the entire sports world, not just football, basketball, but anything that is a major story. Excuse me. So we looked at Carson Vinson, who was a stud. He was an absolute standout in day one. We expected that. But what about guys who maybe could have got their opportunity at a Senior Bowl, could have got their opportunity at a Shrine Bowl? And as it stood, or as it stands, there was only 2 players who were invited. Aaron Smith, linebacker out of South Carolina State, who did not participate because of an injury. So the only one who we have on-field activities to discuss is Carson Vinson. We did talk about Aaron Smith and why I think that it was a blessing in disguise. He was protected from himself that he wasn't able to play. That's the best way to say it. He was protected from himself. But what about a couple of guys, 3 to be specific, who probably should have been in one of these games, whether it's the Senior Bowl or the Shrine Bowl? And I want to start off in the trenches with Elijah Williams. Let's first go through criteria, though. My criteria on what it is that I'm looking for is there has to be a little bit of star power. I want to flash up this top 10 because I think that this is a great example. And I want to be clear. I'm using a tad bit of realism. I think these guys had realistic shots because of everything that goes into their season, how they're viewed, what they've accomplished, and what kind of player they are. The reason I give this disclaimer is because of the guy I'm going to mention first, who didn't make my list of snubs, but I think has the talent. The number 1 player on our top 10, and when Gerald comes in, I think he'll be very high, if not number 1 again, is Robert McDaniel. And the reason I highlight Robert McDaniel as a guy who doesn't make the cut, it's not about talent. Robert McDaniel is talented enough to be here, but I also know that talent never cuts it when you're talking about being an HBCU player. And I know we love to say if you're good enough, they'll find you. And I think to a degree it's true, but also if you're skipped over, you're skipped over. Like at the end of the day, players are skipped over. That happens all the time. And I think it happens to HBCU talent a decent amount. With Robert McDaniel, as good as he is, the stat sheet isn't going to jump off the screen because of the position. I don't think that he gets the shine nationally. I don't think he has the quote unquote star power. He's a great player. Robert McDaniel is a great player, but he was also a guy who I think you could predict would not have made it to the Senior Bowl, would not have made it to the Shrine Bowl, because of 9 times out of 10, you already have the awareness on you. And I don't think the awareness was on McDaniel that way coming into the season. And I don't know if it was necessarily placed on him during the season. And I hope that that's clear. I hope that nobody hears what I'm saying about Robert McDaniel and think that I'm saying he wasn't good enough to be at one of these events, because I'm not saying that. I feel the same way about his teammate, Irv Mulligan. Y'all know how I feel about Irv, but at the same time, I don't think that there's been a spotlight placed on him in a way that would have led to him being here. And my snubs are not guys who are just good enough to be here. They're guys who I think had realistic shots to be here and wasn't made or didn't make the cut. Elijah Williams is a great example. Elijah Williams has one of the biggest spotlights on him in HBCU football this year. I think he has been universally recognized as the best defensive player in HBCU football for the entirety of the year. Before the season, during the season, after the season, I think if you ask somebody who is the best guy, the best defensive player in HBCU football, maybe you ask them to name 3. If I ask 10 people to name the top 3 defensive players in HBCU football coming into the year, I would argue that at least 9 would have said Elijah Williams in their 3. Walking out of the season, I would argue the same amount would say 9 or would put him in the top 3. And I'm not asking you to ask the same people. I'm saying you could ask 20 different people, 10 before the season, 10 after the season. Elijah Williams was going to be in your top 3 HBCU players. He's a dominant force, has been a dominant force, and I think that he has been highlighted for years for being the dominant force that he has been. So with that, listen how I'm discussing him. I'm talking about him versus a guy like Robert McDaniel, who hasn't got the shine, hasn't got the spotlight that I would argue he deserves. A lot of that is, if we go back to the preseason, it was a little bit of a speculation on what he could be. Gerald was talking about how he didn't play in his best position at Alcorn. And when he went to Jackson State, they got him in a better spot. But that's a 1-year sample size. People are hesitant to pull the trigger. There was no reason to be hesitant about Elijah Williams when looking at his body of work. Year 1, freshman year, 7 tackles for a loss, 4 sacks. Then he comes in and has an absolute monster sophomore season where he has 19 TFLs, 9 sacks, follows it up with a little bit of a shorter season. So it was only 9 games compared to 11. A slight drop off in TFLs, probably could have reached the same sack totals, but he had 11 tackles for a loss and 7 sacks. This past year, he had 15 TFLs, 11 sacks. For the first time, he had that double-double in his career. But you're looking at a guy that's been an absolute force. He's a guy who, when we talk to Gerald Huggins, our draft expert, good friend of the show, there is a conversation of how other people approach playing against Elijah Williams. The conversations that center around him are dominant. They are greatness. It's the way we've talked about Elijah Williams for so long. I think it was deserving of a Senior Bowl, of a Shrine Bowl invite, the chance to go and play against these guys. Because to me, if Elijah Williams was at the Shrine Bowl, he would have been one of the biggest stars. And I was at the Shrine Bowl, right? Let me tell you this: interior defensive linemen were some of the biggest talking points of that event. So he would have been in a class where he would have had to stand out. And if he did, he would have been standing out against a guy like Jordan Phillips, a guy like CJ West, a guy like Cam Horsley. You're looking at Maryland. You're looking at Boston College. You're looking at Indiana. And he would have been in that mix. If we're just talking about the West team, they had 2 Georgia boys on the East. So it wasn't like he was going to get free run. If he would have went to that event and performed the way that he performed, mind you what Carson Vinson just said, if he would have played to Elijah Williams' standard in that event, you would be talking about Elijah Williams as a draftable player. It'll be much more difficult without that, but I believe he had the ability to go to this event and do it. And I wish that he would have. He's probably my biggest snub. If the guy who's the next closest will be James Burgess. I want to talk about him and another fellow defensive back who have one thing in common that I would have liked to see get them in this position as we wrap up today's episode of Locked On HBCU. As we're wrapping up today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day, every day, making it all the way to segment 3, and I thank you 2 times for that. Thank you. Thank you. There's 2 more guys that I want to highlight as snubs, and that's James Burgess, cornerback out of Alabama State, and then also Kenny Gallop, defensive back out of Howard. I want to start off with Burgess because to me, Burgess was the best defender. He was arguably the best defender. I know that he didn't win co-defensive player of the year, but a lot of that has to do with position. And despite playing a premier position in football on the defensive side of the ball, it simply isn't enough that you could really do at cornerback outside of interceptions to get this stat, like to get this award. So it goes to Andrew Jones. It goes to Kelby Givens, who both had great seasons. Had great season. Jones is at Ole Miss now, I believe. Um, he did South Carolina and Ole Miss. I'm trying to remember which one came first, but y'all know I think Jones is a fantastic player. So it's not a situation of putting down either one of those guys. I just know that the award wasn't going to get split three ways. It'd be nice if it could have, but I think that Andrew Jones, or excuse me, James Burgess was one of, if not the best defender. I do believe he was the most consistent defender in the SWAC in 2024. This guy is a lockdown corner. You had Caleb Alford on the other side, both of which just manned aside. You take the offense's left, you take the offense's right. And Burgess didn't get attacked a lot. He really didn't. He had great shutdown coverage. But when he did get attacked, it wasn't much giving up. Instead, it was a lot of taking the ball away. I don't believe that he gave up a touchdown this entire time. I've talked to Coach James about how they performed and how they taught their cornerbacks at Alabama State. And it was a lot of playing aggressive. And he was like, listen, we are going to play aggressive, so we may give some things up. I don't remember that happening in the Burgess a lot. I do not. And talking to a coach who tells me we may give some things up because we play aggressive, but we also are going to bunker down right away, to know that's the mentality and to know that your star corner is definitely adopting that mentality, but he's not giving anything up, to me speaks volumes. He was a absolute shutdown corner on the outside on that offensive left side of the football, or the defense is right, however you want to phrase it. And most importantly, because remember, being good isn't enough, right? James Burgess could have went to the Shrine Bowl, because guess who was at the Shrine Bowl last year? Mikey Victor, Alabama State. He could have went to the Shrine Bowl because he was the Aeneas Williams Award winner for being the best defensive back in Black college football. I do believe that those awards and that those accolades mean something. They come with a spotlight. I do believe that it was a little bit more difficult to miss James Burgess. There's a strong argument that James Burgess, and I know I just said this about Elijah Williams because of the 4-year body of work, the way that everybody talks about him, from analysts to teammates to opponents. But I believe there's a strong case that James Burgess is the biggest all-star snub. And yes, he went to the Hula Bowl, but I'm speaking about the Shrine Bowl and Senior Bowl. There is a strong argument that James Burgess is the biggest snub from an HBCU in these 2025 NFL draft bowls, because you look at the fact that his teammate Mikey Victor was there just the year prior. You look at the fact that Burgess is the Aeneas Williams Award winner. So you have a familiarity with the school. You have an accolade like the Aeneas Williams Award. And then most importantly, it's not like Alabama State hasn't been putting out defensive backs on a regular basis. You are not missing James Burgess, in my opinion. If you did, that is completely your fault and is inexcusable. I believe he should have been at a Shrine Bowl, at a Senior Bowl, because of the track record of his school, the quality of his play, and the accolades that he has been given in his final year of college football. But now you look at somebody else who also has an Aeneas Williams Award in his trophy case, and that is Kenny Gallop. Kenny Gallop is a player who I believe can play all over the field. I believe that in a NFL system where we like to have, it's funny because the box safety, right? That used to be so assaulted verbally. It used to be slandered ridiculously. But at the same time, I do kind of see the box safety becoming a thing again. I see a lot of guys who are playing close to the box. I see a lot of cover one. Like I just see a lot of that these days. Cover three. Like it's more single high. It's more middle of the field closed than I feel like was. Maybe I'm just noticing it more. So let me not even speak on the trends, but I'll say, or let me not speak on the coverages itself. The way we're talking about these guys who play closer to the line of scrimmage is not as slandered as it used to be. It's no longer looked at as a limitation. It's looked at as a benefit to these NFL teams. Kenny Gallop is a guy, though he has the ability to play deep. You see the aggression that he plays with. You see the physicality that he plays with, whether it's defending tight ends, whether it's playing the run. And one thing that I love about him, because I'm not here to just tell you how great a player is, though I do believe it's an important thing to state. There's also the factor that he played against a Northwestern. He played against a Rutgers. He played against a Eastern Washington, if I'm not mistaken, Eastern Michigan, excuse me, in the first game of last season, 2023 season. And in those games, he had pretty solid games, man. He had a sack and a tackle for a loss against Northwestern. He had a tackle for a loss against Eastern Michigan. Against Rutgers, he was one of the few players who I thought actually played well. He was one of the few stars for Howard. And that defense did play well in the beginning of the year or the beginning of that game as a unit. But Kenny Gallop was one of the dudes who led the charge in that. Being an Aeneas Williams Award winner, being a guy who showed up against these big schools, I think he's checked the box for everything that you're really supposed to do, and he did it. So if you're asking me which players should have been at these games, because it's one thing to say, why do we only have 2 players who are at the East-West Shrine Bowl and Senior Bowl combined? That's Aaron Smith and Carson Vinson. But it's another thing to say who else should be there, because that's an appropriate question. I have an answer to that. Elijah Williams, defensive tackle, Morgan State. James Burgess, defensive back, Alabama State. And then Kenny Gallop, defensive back, Howard. Those are the 3 players who I believe deserved to be at an East-West Shrine Bowl against top talent at a Senior Bowl. I believe they deserved that opportunity. Now, tomorrow, we're going to get, speaking of Howard, we're going to get Howard versus FAMU at the Orange Blossom Classic. I hope that this is a thing that we see continuing. It doesn't have to be Howard, but FAMU's inclusion in this game is something that was missing last year, and I think it's right that we bring it back. Let's talk about that on tomorrow's episode, as well as FAMU basketball. So, Rattler Nation, show me some love tomorrow. In the meantime, in between time, until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care, stay blessed. Peace.